Okay, hey, hello everyone. We are the book club, still no name book club, but we are here today to continue our discussion of So You Want to Talk About Race. We're missing a few of our friends tonight, and maybe one or two maybe coming in a little late, but it's nonetheless, we're going to continue forward, and we're looking forward to this conversation. And we will be discussing the next 4 chapters in the book. So we will be covering, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. It's been a day. We'll be covering chapters 9 through 12. And yeah, so as before, I think originally we took a very structured approach, just getting warmed up to each other. But being that we've kind of gotten a little comfortable, we'll just like go into conversation. I guess Robin and we wanted to start off with a question. We're not going to go in order of chapter. We'll bounce around. And at any point, y'all just add topics, questions, and just as we've been doing. So the question is, I'm gonna flip in my book because it's in my book. And give me, I'm gonna go to this. Okay. So when we say this statement, we ask that any of you raise your hand if you've ever been asked this particular question, and then we'll follow that up with another part of the question. So literally all you do is just raise your hand if you've been asked that question. So here's the question. Are you visiting this neighborhood? Has anyone been asked that question before? Okay, out of the people who raised their hand, have any of you been offended by that question? Okay, we're missing some participants, so it really was not planned this way for it to be this way in terms of just 3 people saying yes. But we want to talk about that. So I think this goes nicely into our topic of microaggressions in the book. And there's many other that they listed. So there are some microaggressions that, first, let's identify that we are discussing microaggressions, and that particular question came from the microaggression chapter, which we'll discuss why. But we also identified that not everyone, that we didn't go through all. So that maybe others of you have experienced the microaggression, and we just didn't ask that particular one. So I'm not trying to say that just me, Thomas, and Robin can discuss on microaggressions, but just a segue into it. So I guess we can start by, for those who have heard that asked that question, why did you raise your hand when you said that you were offended by that question? What was so offensive about a very simple question such as, are you visiting this neighborhood? Yeah, and whoever can go can go.
I'll start out because I think last week I actually wrote down what what Will was kind of explaining so really eloquently about outcomes versus intentions, and it's crazy the amount of times I think I've used that this week with just conversations I've had with people and like working all different stuff or working all these different things. So someone's intention could be like, why are you in this neighborhood? They might be trying to just genuinely figure that out, but if a white person would ask you that, and me, a black person, like I'm always thinking of, I wonder like what's that deeper meaning of what they could be trying to ask. Is this a way to harm me in a certain way? Is this a way to think that my blackness is a part of me not being able to meet the criteria to either walk or just live and be in this neighborhood? And so I thought it was super interesting where she talks in the book, I think she talks in throughout all these chapters that we read, about how blackness basically means, or being black in America means that you will always, your life is almost not your own, and you can always be at harm in different ways, and you're always someone where you're trying to subscribe to an identity of whiteness that America has played up and made the standard. And so you are always, trying to figure out where do you see yourself in that. But based on like I get offended by different things like that because it's a critique of because of your skin color, you should not be here. You know, you should be somewhere else. This place, this sanctioned community, or this suburbia, you know, is not the place for you. Maybe you should go somewhere else. And that's the type of vibes that I get from that. And microaggressions, I think, are one of the scariest and the toughest to tackle because they happen so often, probably even today. And like I think it's crazy that I say that, but I think it's the genuine truth that they happen so often that a lot of times we don't even always recognize them. But they are always prevalent, and it can happen so easily. And it's almost like we've heard this so many times before, like a bee sting one time. It's like maybe it doesn't hurt the first time, but then when you get 20 in a week or so, or you get 20 a day or something like that, then you're going to quote unquote like go off on someone because of that. So it's that constant thing of you never know what the deeper meaning behind a sentence can mean.
Devin, you're on mute.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, sorry, everyone. I think the thing with microaggressions is that it's like the book described, it's micro, it's small. Like it just seems so kind of like just not in any way harmful. However, it also talks about how they're cumulative. So like in one instance, a microaggression may not be that harmful or like hurt, and you may not even realize that it was a microaggression, but it's like something that when you think about, you're like, oh, I don't know how I felt about that. And then over time, to continue to get a certain comment or look or whatever the microaggression may be, you kind of sit in a moment where you're just like, gosh, like why does this keep happening? And to the question of, are you visiting this neighborhood? Actually recently got asked this question. I was actually in my neighborhood. So my family and I just relocated, and we relocated to a neighborhood that has like neighborhood watch type of security going through. And we were heading to like the country club building, and a person stopped my mom and I. Mind you, like, I mean, there was nothing like that. We weren't speeding. We were, just going where we needed to go pick up our tags, like for the neighborhood that we recently moved into. And he just stopped and said, are you like visiting? Like, do you need help? Are you, and mind you, like there was nothing that necessarily in our minds would, think that we needed help because we were driving, we knew where we were going, and there was just no need to be stopped. And it was interesting. It's like microaggressions are one of those things where, like Thomas mentioned, like you can kind of maybe, you don't know a person's intent. So I can't say that man profiled us. I can't definitively say that because I don't know his intent behind the question. So I don't want to say he's a horrible person, and we didn't accuse him of being a horrible person. But knowing how sometimes, for me as a Black person in this society is sometimes treated solely because of my skin color, being in a space in the neighborhood where it is predominantly white, and just for him to just feel the need to ask us, like, are we visiting? And not necessarily assuming like, oh, they probably live here. Like that wasn't his assumption. His assumption was like, do they need help? Like, are they lost? It just was kind of in a way insulting, and kind of felt like, do I not belong here? Like, what about our car and where we were alarmed? Alarmed you or compelled you to come ask us if we were visiting and if we needed help finding where we were going. Like, why didn't you assume that we lived here? So I think with microaggressions, they are small, but they can become significant because you're constantly, put in a position where you're having to like question a compliment. Like another one I've gotten is that's actually listed in the book. A rendition of this is, wow, you speak English really well. People have literally told me like I'm so articulate and well spoken, and it's hard because it sounds like a compliment, but I think constantly getting that in spaces where it seems like I'm the only minority. It's just like, and I'm the only one who seems to get that compliment. Like none of my non-minority peers seem to get that in terms of like an awe factor. It's not like, oh, you did a really good job on that speech and it was great content. It's been like, you articulated that so well. Like you spoke really well. And it's just kind of like, am I not supposed to? Like, so again, microaggressions can be really small, but over time they kind of are like, you know, it can become a lot. So any thoughts on that?
I'll say I really liked your comment about like how microaggressions sort of like make you feel like you don't belong. And I can definitely relate because I feel like microaggressions sort of promote like this sense of like otherness to whoever's like getting the microaggression. I think they're used to make you feel like other, like you're not the default, like I'm specifically labeling you as this, whenever I hear like is that your real hair, or if I hear like a teacher or a professor saying your name is like a handful to pronounce, or your name is like really complex, but never hearing those statements and being said to like my white counterparts, and they're only like spoken to minorities, it just further like promotes like that sense of like othering, and like that process of like othering, and like you don't belong, like you're not part of this community that we have built, like you're not a part of us, you're other. And so that's how I always feel whenever I get statements like that, and it's difficult to try and like push back against like that othering process.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also really challenging to explain to people like why they like are so hurtful. Like I worked as an RA this past year, and in RA training we had a session about microaggressions, and I guess unsurprisingly a lot of people in the room didn't even know what they were. And there was someone who was like in the training with me, and he was white, and I was explaining how I always get asked, where are you from? And in college it's like a pretty common question, but I've been getting asked that question since I was like a kid. And it is a microaggression because everyone assumes like I can't speak English, or I'm an international student, or like I'm an immigrant or something like that. And I was trying to explain like why it's so offensive, and he was like, well, what's the big deal if someone asks you where you're from? Like everyone in college wants to, because I knew that he had never been in a situation where getting a simple question like that is offensive to him. So I really liked how like in the book she kind of like touches on like the severity of the problem, but how to other people they're not really perceived as serious, and how she really takes the time to validate like microaggressions and the impact they can have on a person, because so many times even like non-white people have like invalidated like me or like my friends who have also experienced microaggressions. And I think it's really important to just like start off and like validate that they exist and that they're really hurtful.
You're muted, Diamond.
I keep doing that. Y'all. Today has been a long day. But to your point, Roanne, it says how microaggressions are a serious problem beyond the emotional and physical effects they have on the person they are perpetrated against. They have much broader social implications. They normalize racism. They make racist assumptions a part of everyday life. And so thinking that something seemingly so innocent can impact people in such a way, that, it also, it shows how microaggressions, while on the surface seem, harmless and that's not really a big deal, can actually negatively impact people. And even still, like, even if it's, not overtly racist or something, it can still just be like, make people feel like they're not a part, like Robin said, make people feel like they, just are, it's like an othering type of thing. It makes people feel like they're outside of the group or the circle, because of some of the comments or the microaggressions that are, done against them. And sometimes people don't even, have bad intent, but, still, may say or do in like a microaggression. And I think it's like Roanne said, it just comes to listening to people and hearing that, like, okay, this is why this is a microaggression. Maybe I should take a different approach to complimenting or, interacting with that individual. Any thoughts, comments?
It kind of reminds me, like, as we're talking about like intentions versus actions and like the cumulative effect of those microaggressions, like earlier in the book when she was talking about, I think it was the "Is It Really About Race" chapter, when she made the analogy of like, if you're walking down the street and every 50 yards someone would punch you in the arm, and like that, what effect that would have on you over and over and over again, and eventually you're gonna like blow up. It's like, why wouldn't you? And like to that person, they may not have meant anything by it, and they might not have even realized like the effect, and they may try to like gaslight you or minimize you, and like, oh, like I just said this one little thing or did this one little thing, like, or like I didn't mean it this way or this way. But when it's over and over and over and over again, even those little things can like add up and be like really damaging.
Right. And they're done in a way that I think, like we said, are just so easy to miss. And also so easy to pass off as like, oh, that's nothing. Kind of moving into that other chapter, like why I can't touch your hair. That I think that was just her way of explaining a microaggression and from her perspective as a Black woman. She devoted an entire chapter to it. And it was one of those things where I think a question to ask is, who likes, so I think this is just a blanket question that we can maybe pose to everyone. Does anyone mind if a random individual comes and touches them out of admiration? And so there's no harm being done, but it's just like a person physically touches you, just admiring you, and just comes and touches you, and you have no idea who that person is. Does anyone mind that? Is anyone who like doesn't care? Yeah, you would mind.
Absolutely.
You're saying you would mind. If anyone like wouldn't mind, that's fine. It's not like your rhetorical question. It's really asking. So I think looks like everyone would mind. And so that happens, and that's just the example that I think she gave, because she again is speaking from the perspective as a Black woman. And if anyone has another example to share, go for it. But she speaks about this idea of like why I can't touch your hair. What were people's thoughts on that? Like before we even get into it, like what did people think about that? I don't know. We're just curious.
So I really like that chapter. I thought it was really cool that she dedicated a whole chapter to that. I actually get asked that question a lot. It's much different for me, and I know that, but I have curly hair, and I guess this is like just so cool to people. Yeah. And I always get asked like, "Oh, is that your natural hair?" Like, and I truly don't. I don't even know if I can. I don't think it's harmful. I wouldn't consider those microaggressions, but people do that. People were like, "Oh, can I touch it? Like, is it, what does it feel like?" And it's just really annoying. I don't want people to touch me.
Yeah. So, and I mean, that's your experience. Like, speak on that for sure.
And so I'm sure it doesn't really bother me. It just kind of annoys me. But I don't have kind of like the history behind that question that other people do. So I can imagine that on top of just the annoyance, with kind of like the added weight to that question, it can be not only annoying but like aggravating and could actually make you angry.
Yeah, no, I love that you mentioned that. I mean, that's your experience, and I think that experience is very valid, and I think that honestly connects a lot to how I think from her perspective as a Black woman, I think I just think people, it's just this thing where it's like, I don't think many people would like to just randomly be touched. And I like how you added the aspect of even the historical context. I mean, like, add it to that for, Blacks in this country, where we were treated as literally like objects and items. And while we recognize that times are different, there's still historical meaning behind the reason why we do what we do, and why sometimes things are much deeper than what it looks like on the surface. You go generations and generations of being treated as objects and as essentially animal to be sold, and it's not that it's like, okay, I don't like, it's the historical context behind it as well. And so it's like, I don't want to be just poked and prodded as if I'm just like, ask me, don't just come and touch me as if I'm some exotic thing to touch. I'm
Right.
a human being. Like, I'm a person. You don't just get to come in my personal space. Just as much as you feel that way about your space, it gets annoying. It's like, I don't appreciate someone just touching me out of curiosity, which I have had people do to me for my hair, and will just touch it as if it's like, this just weird, like, wow, like I'm not a doll baby. Like, I have a name and you can talk to me, So she dedicated a whole chapter to that. Any other thoughts on that? Because even if it doesn't directly correlate with what she said, even this idea of like personal space in society today.
I think this was probably my maybe my favorite chapter of the book, because I think she just beautifully explains like what it is to be a Black woman in America and have to deal with a lot of struggles that are very plain to maybe other people, but the subconscious and the emotional side to it, I think was just written really well. And I think I wrote this quote down, how when the guy, well, at the dinner table, which, God, Lord, why did he do that? I was just off. I could feel the awkwardness just from there and just from listening to it. But he wanted me to know that he approved of my hair that finally was existing outside of his beauty norms, but still he thought that my hair growing on my head from my body was within his jurisdiction. And I kind of thought of, like, for me, I thought of, that's so interesting how so many Black people, in order to be successful or to like climb this ranks and ladder of success, what success even looks like in an America that's not built for you, it is very much of, you need to look very clean cut. You need to be doing this. You need to maybe straighten your hair for this thing. And maybe you need to cut your hair for this thing. Maybe a person, with dreads should not be in this job. And that's how a lot of people think, because it's almost like for Black people, you have to have the most clean cut ways, and don't deviate from the norm, as long as it's good and palatable for the white boss that you have. And I thought that was super interesting, and that's what it made me think of, how success looks super different compared to other places. And being in a corporate world or being in an office space, in that culture, you are thinking about so many other different things, because you are still trying to not conform to this normalcy, but making sure that, I know I'm Black already, and I know I already stick out because of this. Let me not do anything else to aid to that. And I think that can be emotionally taxing as well, and something that's not always talked about.
You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
um it's been a day, but it definitely was, and that example that she gave in the book was definitely something to think about. Okay, so sorry for the little mishap, but we're back. So just continuing with our conversation, we were talking about microaggressions and how they impact people, even though the intent may not to necessarily be to hurt people. Any other like thoughts about this chapter or these chapters in terms of anything that you all want to bring up or thought was noteworthy or to call attention to?
I just really like our kind of like how we are like talking about like intentions and actions. And one example it made me think of was that there's this one video that I was watching one time, and it was like by BuzzFeed or like one of their channels, and they were talking about like basically dismantle stereotypes about like women who are bald. And so the intention of the video was good, but then in the middle of the video, they interviewed a Muslim woman who wears hijab so that she could share her similar experience. And it was just like really weird because it's not the same thing. And I think even sometimes, like my point, I guess, is that sometimes even the person who the microaggression is being made against might not realize it's a microaggression, because in that situation, they're like equating things that aren't the same at all. And it's a microaggression towards like bald women and towards the Muslim woman. And sometimes, like, I think that's why it's so hard to like handle these kinds of things, is because sometimes you don't even know if it's a microaggression. Like, if someone's like, where are you from? I'm like, are they curious or are they racist? You know, like, not racist, but like, you know, they have like an assumption about what an American should look like. So I think that's just one thing that is also like challenging about it. And I think that just like reading the chapter on this was like really helpful, and would be helpful for anyone who's like confused on it or like wants to be able to navigate these conversations better.
Absolutely. And to that point, kind of just like, I don't know, just recognizing like kind of, even with microaggressions, I think identity is important, because I think understanding, I think this whole book, just taking a step away just from microaggressions for a second, I think this whole book really sums up why narratives are important and why identity is important. And I say that because throughout this entire book, dealing with topics of race, it's more than just the surface of like skin color. It's like the narrative behind why people do what they do and why they say what they say. It always points back to historical context. And how, you know, you don't just, and with microaggressions, they seem so like, you know, just simple. But if you don't understand context, if you don't understand identities, like whether it be like your own identity or even having a certain level of awareness of the identities of others around you, it is very easy to offend someone or to say something that's racist or to do something that's insensitive, or oppressive to someone else. And that's why these conversations are so important, and kind of just like, you know, grow in what you're saying about Black, you know, that we're having these conversations, is because, I mean, ignorance is definitely a thing, but it isn't an excuse. Ignorance is definitely a reason why people may behave the way they do, but it absolutely isn't an excuse to do certain things and then knowingly continue to do things because it doesn't affect maybe yourself or the people you know. And I think, honestly, like taking this as not really an aside, it all goes together. I think that's what we're kind of seeing today in society. Like right now, with all that's going on, I think we're, you know, at a place where it's like, at this point, if you're choosing to ignore what's going on, it's just, I don't really see how there's a way to ignore what's going on, put it that way. With all that we're seeing right now, and the narratives that we're saying and the things that we're talking about are going to shape how future generations respond and learn and react. Oh, and one last thing, I actually want y'all's opinion on this. What do we think about okay, this is the reason I have the conversation, so we're gonna go for it. What do you all think about our education system and how it teaches about racism in this country? And not just racism, but just like even the historical context of how this country has treated, obviously, Blacks in this country, but even other racial groups who are not white, and the historical context that we get. What are y'all's thoughts on that? And because I think that that also is dictating why, like a reason why we're seeing what we're seeing today, because people are so ignorant to all that really went on. Like, I think our education system made slavery seem like, and this is going to sound harsh, but like almost like roses in comparison to what it truly was. But thoughts on that?
So I don't think I've ever actually learned, especially in like high school or, you know, like actually learned about racism. That I can remember, like this was never a conversation that I had in any class. Something that's actually I've been thinking about a lot recently is in 8th grade at my school was like the year you did South Carolina history. And of course, the Civil War was a large part of South Carolina's history, and there was one teacher that taught the whole middle school's history classes. And her big thing was that the Civil War was not about slavery, but it was about states' rights. And she would make us recite this to her and write it on our tests, and like that was the correct answer to this question. And she like completely said like, you know, states wanted their rights and their like individual like autonomy to make the laws that are best for their state. It wasn't about slavery at all. And I believed this in the 8th grade. And as I became a real person in the world, I learned that this was not the case, and that it was about states' rights, but the states' rights to have legal slavery. And that's just like complete erasure of the like the true history of South Carolina. And I feel like this happens maybe in not such blatant ways, or maybe in even more blatant ways, especially in the American South, which is truly sad because the people living in the American South were the most affected by the Civil War. It infuriates me to this day that, you know, hundreds of students were, you know, taught that and were counted correct answers on tests. So it's a large issue, I think.
Sorry, Thomas, were you speaking?
Oh no, go ahead, Will. Go ahead.
Okay. Something that I was thinking a lot about this week was, you know, it's like the idea of the difference in a sin of omission and a sin of commission. And I feel like a lot of the problem in our educational system is sins of omission, where things like what we're taught for the most part is accurate, if not like you know, as accurate as you can explain to someone in the 8th grade, but it's not inaccurate, but it's not the complete picture. Like, yes, there's an element to which the states' rights issue factored into the Civil War, but that was 6 out of like the 85 articles of secession, and the other 79 were about slavery. So, and then like another thing that I was thinking about was like, I think it was also my 8th grade year where we had like 2 days talking about the lost cause of the Confederacy, which was an important thing that like had like historical relevance to the South. But why did we spend 2 days talking about it? That could have been like a 5-minute conversation of, you know, of that. And we never talked about something like the Friendship 9. So like to me, it's a lot, so much is left out that people leave thinking they've got this complete picture of a march toward perfection that never took place.
I definitely I definitely agree with that, because I don't even know how I put this. A lot of times education is at the basis of so many institutions. It's one of the main institutions that kind of foundationally kind of builds up America, and trying to figure out how we learn, how we receive education, and how we build up this next generation of people. And we hear that all the time. And I think constantly, all the time, we are having a lot of things left out. And so on one hand, I'm like, it's how do we prioritize what's being said, and what's, you know, how do we do this? But I think maybe this is just me being angry and emotional, but I think I just tired of things being palatable for everyone. And maybe sometimes like our McGraw-Hill textbooks or whatever made things, told some truths, absolutely, and definitely did that. And like Will put it really great, omission versus commission. But there are so many different things I believe that deserve to be taught and really need to be brought to the forefront. And I think it's a lot of times of how do we make this information easy for kids to digest? And I don't know what's the best way to do that when trying to teach someone about enslavement, or, you know, teaching the Emmett Till story to kids in elementary school. I had a recent conversation with someone that was white that said they didn't know about that until just this past month. And that shocked me. And I was like, in 7th grade, you know, that's what I learned about it, because I went to predominantly Black schools, and even the teachers diverted from the curriculum and said, this is the important stuff that you really need to know. for me and for my identity was super helpful, and crafted a lot of why I think some of the ways I think today. But I think in a lot of ways, I would put it bluntly, our education system has failed us, and not teaching us everything that I believe personally that should be taught, in terms of making Martin Luther King being the saint, making Malcolm X being the bad person. That's one that really grinds my gears, to be honest. And so I don't know. This one's always an emotional thing for me. Like when Diamond brought it up, I think I felt my blood boiling on the inside, because it really gets me angry, because I think education is super important in this country. And for a place to preach at an early age that this is a melting pot, and for Black people to have they've spent their whole lives fighting to make the Constitution actually believable, is what gets me angry.
Yeah, Thomas, to your point about like the importance of education, um, it's like a lot of people that talk about, or a lot of education philosophers that talk about how like education, um, of course, it's the key to life, but it's not just like, we often think of it as like a preparation for life, as something that we use to prepare us to go out into the world and do whatever. But they take their understanding of it is like, no, education is life. Like education never stops. You get your instruction in elementary, and then high school, college, but the learning never stops. Whatever job you go and work, you're gonna have to continue to learn that job, and then if you get promoted, you're gonna have to continue to learn that job, and that's just in that lane. You're gonna have to learn how to be a parent. You're gonna have to learn how to be, I don't know, a family member. It's just everything. So many different things you got to learn. So many different things that you continue to learn later on in life. Like I learned how to braid my hair, like like just stuff like that. Like just as a small example. So I think that's like a huge thing to point out, like the importance of education and how something like that can have like a fundamental impact on like people's the way people live life afterwards. But to respond to like the question, I thought about it from like two perspectives. So on one hand, like with my job, like we do a lot of education, curriculum development and stuff. Like we're trying to make sure the curriculum is more inclusive, and different backgrounds and cultures and races and so forth are represented. And I I do a lot of Black history work, but we span all like races, cultures, and whatnot. So I've also gotten to do some work that opened my eyes about stuff that I didn't know, that I didn't learn in the education system, and made me wonder more about it, given my perspective as a Black person. So, for example, I found out there was a Chinese Exclusion Act I think the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1924 or something like that, that excluded Chinese from immigrating to the United States. But that wasn't surprising to see, because, and I'm not proud to say this, I kind of brushed it to the side, but in undergrad, I had read a Supreme Court justice opinion where he talked about, I don't know if y'all are familiar with him, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. He was the only Supreme Court justice to dissent. And in his dissent, um, he's standing up for civil rights in his way. But he also mentions Chinese immigrants in the dissent, and says that while Black Americans can get like basic civil rights, Chinese Americans, or people of Chinese descent, no, they need to stay in Asia. It was pretty bad, and he also said the same thing about Native Americans. So stuff like that kind of made me think about all of the other things about other cultures and other races and other backgrounds, kind of beyond just Black and white. Because as an American, that's kind of the two-sided, um, the two kind of histories that are often like placed at the center of things. But you got Native American civil rights movement. They have organizations like Women of All Red Nations. You had a Mexican American civil rights movement. John C. Calhoun used to talk. He used to say racist stuff about Mexicans back in the day. Matter of fact, Frederick Douglass wrote a letter to him where he talked about that. And then in the 60s, you had this movement called the Third Liberation Front. I just learned about this like last week. But the Third Liberation movement is why we have African American studies. It's why we have Asian American studies, Mexican American studies. Why we have those things in universities and are actually like learning those things and putting that kind of scholarship out into the world, because you had Black student unions, Asian American student unions, Mexican American student unions, all coming together to during that third world liberation movement, to demand for the ethnic studies research centers, more diversity in higher education, things like that. And so like just learning those things in itself like made me wonder like, wow, I know there's so much more that I don't know, and that a lot of people don't know about like other groups that are in America, besides Black and white people. And then, so answering this question from the perspective, or my perspective as a Black person, or thinking about it that way, I definitely feel like our education system is deeply flawed. I think there's certainly, I wouldn't say the stuff we learn isn't true. I definitely agree that there's truth to the things that we learn, even the states' right thing. But it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, hold on, states' rights to do what? All right, then now we get to the point. So that's what I'm saying. It's just like a partial truth and not like the full truth and the full perspective of things. We kind of get like one perspective of things. And I think if we were to get, because you can't really remove people that were living in America from American history because they were there, no matter how hard you try. You can ignore their perspective, but you can't remove them from history. You can't remove them from the things that were going on in the country. So to some degree, I mean, you're going to have to incorporate them into the historical narrative, but that doesn't mean that the story has to be told, or their perspective at all has to even be incorporated or valued within it. And I think that's what the problem is. But I also think it's a point about omission as well, because we learn about figures from slavery like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and then we get to the Civil Rights Movement and we learn about figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But that leaves out so many people, like people that paved the way for those people, people that came before them. There were people Black folks that were talking about Black liberation before Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Alado Equiano wrote a whole autobiography where he was talking about who's related to that. There were also people during Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass' time that were there were white people doing fighting for slavery to be abolished. So many, and a lot of them are left out of history. And I also think that kind of plays a role in why when we think about slavery, it's kind of this idea of like that it was okay because it was like normal, but that was never the case, because there was always a group of people speaking out against it, trying to end it, and then even the politicians that had mixed views on that. All of them weren't pro-slavery. They all had complicated views about it.
And to your point, it's interesting because I think that idea, and hopefully I can't remember if I said like incorrect, so y'all, I definitely misspoke if I said that it was incorrect. I guess if I said that, I can't remember if I did or not, but I'm kind of tired tonight, so I might have. But I guess just this sense that like to your point, that I think it's like slavery as I remember it being taught to me, and I think, like you said, there's so much more history beyond just the black and white dichotomy that we see in this country that seems to be just the forefront of what we're taught. So in speaking to that, like being that that was like primarily what I was taught about like slavery in this country, it was almost like this glamorization factor. I remember taking field trips to like plantations, and looking back on that, that actually to me now was like pretty problematic. And I'll tell you why I think that was problematic for me. It was problematic because when we got there, everything was just seemed so glamorized. And I use that term glamorized loosely. I think anyone can understand that slavery was not good. I would hope so. But by glamorized, I mean they did not speak, and I understand that at the time we were like little kids, and you definitely have to be watchful how you teach children, but to the same extent you can't make something feel flowery or feel like it wasn't, like it was bad but not necessarily speak to the severity of how bad something like slavery was and how traumatic it was for those who endured that time period. We would go on the plantation and it'd be like, yeah, this was the slave master's house. And the slaves would come through this door and feed their masters, and they would eat this. And these are time for the kind of foods they'd eat during Thanksgiving. And these are like the little chairs they sat on. And these were like the little, they had like little fascinating, like little, like actually like kind of like a toilet seating like in their seats or their chairs, like a little pot under, like just like interesting stuff from their time. And like this was the outfields, and like, you know, they would have to use the restroom in these areas. And it wasn't necessarily like speaking on how like they literally were beat like no other, beat like animals, sold bottom naked in front of men and women that they didn't know to be sold. And it was just like, it didn't really speak to the reality of what slavery was. And I think coming out of that, it almost in a sense made it feel like, okay, it was slavery, and you know it's bad, but you don't really recognize how bad it was because we didn't really confront that in the classroom. And conversations surrounding slavery in the classroom were very much slavery was bad. They fought for their freedom, and then we hit civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. It didn't really speak, and even in high school, like it didn't really even speak to the severity and the trauma which slavery was in this country. And a professor, I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Eddie Glaude, is that how you say his name? Anyone who I'm speaking about? He said something so powerful one time. He said, until America truly confronts what slavery was in this nation, we will continue to see the problems that we're facing today. And I'm not even saying it as the way that he did it. He said it so powerfully, and I'll send a link to our group afterwards so you all can see. But until our country, and I thought that was so true, until our country really acknowledges slavery in a sense where we don't make it seem like slavery was bad, but really confront the evils that were done, and even speak to our children about it, letting them know that it wasn't just something that we read about in the third grade and we move on from and go to civil rights and we're all singing Kumbaya. Like it needs to be a sort of like humility and learning that kind of stuff, and it's just not there. And so I think going into our conversations now, I think it definitely is impacting these cycles of what we continue to see, because our nation just doesn't seem to be confronting our history in a way that allows us to learn from it and actually move from it. We just find reasons to avoid those conversations and try to just create this world where it seems like everything's okay now. And then every generation he spoke, and he kind of mentioned this, it's something else that reveals ourselves to ourselves, and seeing that we're not in any way where we really should be. And it's because we're not really confronting the harsh reality in the way that we should. And it starts with education and what we talk about and things that we mention.
One thing to your point that you made about like slavery and how it's taught, one thing that I always think about this, and I don't know, like I still think about it, and I don't know, something I can't get over. So like just like how you described like how slavery was, I think that's how we learn about like the Holocaust. Like that's how we learn about like Hitler and like how he was. Like I feel like we learn people like Hitler and people like terrorists like Al Qaeda, like I don't know. They're we often like learn about them more in like a villainous light than we learn about like our own people, our own presidents that that own slaves, and like what being a slave owner like actually meant, like like what it actually meant you supported and more than likely did, like going off of the stories from the slaves themselves, slave narratives, and what they were talking about. Like that's kind of scary to think, when you start thinking like, oh, well, George Washington owned slaves and he was the first president of the United States, and like we celebrate him and all of that for being the first president. But where's like the complication at? Because here's a person that was a part of a system that led to war, more violence, death, sexual violence, um, exploitation. I mean, you named it. What didn't slavery allow? And so that for me is when it's like, how do we reckon with that? That's my question from that. It's like, how do we reckon with that? Because I mean, yeah, he was the first president, and played an instrumental role in, United States, formation and whatnot. But who, like, and obviously he wasn't the only one. Right. So, like, how do we grapple with that? Like, and that's one of the things we talk about when we talk about like teaching like hard histories and stuff like that. But I think that gets to Eddie Glau's point, like, like that's one of those things where it's like, because a lot of people have like this vision of George Washington as being this like really this true American, like the person that emulates what it means to be an American, the ultimate American citizen. He was a war general, like all of that, like a president. He embodies all of that stuff. But this guy like owned slaves, and like, do you know what that means? Like he supported and like sponsored and all that. And it's just like, and then when you think about it from an individual standpoint, literally, if, for example, if your name is last name is Washington and you're Black, you might wonder, did he own some of my ancestors? And if he treated, if like just thoughts about how he might have, things he might have done, or that might have happened, like, then that becomes like a personal thing, and it's like, it complicates it even more.
Yeah.
I just think about that's all.
Yeah, no, I think I think it's conflicting because I know you and I sat in our American Founders class together. Great professor, I thought. He was I really enjoyed the class. So for me, and I don't know, Will may find this an interesting perspective, and I think it's pretty cool we had the same class. I sat in this class where we were like kind of speaking on American founders and kind of just spoke about the Constitution and things of that. And it was difficult sometimes sitting in that class. And for me, it was difficult because it was always like, I see it, like I want to buy into this idea of, just our founding and like what that meant and the significance of our Constitution and how just unique and powerful that document is. But then also just like you teeter back and forth because you also know the historical context behind those men and behind our founders and how it's just conflicting. And sometimes I think that we struggle with our education system for sure, telling a story that goes beyond idolizing those men and beyond just like, sure, they did a great thing, but then, and not just speaking on those founding men, but also just our nation as a whole, like our principles, like it's just like we tell, and that's what I was saying, narratives are so important. Like narratives influence how we interact with each other in society. And if we're working on a narrative that doesn't include the whole story, our society is going to suffer because we're not reckoning with the parts of ourselves that we need to be able to create a better society. It's great to tell one part of history, but we have to tell the other side, and we have to do its due diligence. We can't just, brush over it and think that, okay, we're good, check, 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 check. Now let's go back to just loving America so much and thinking that it's just beyond great. Like, we have to reckon with those parts of our history that weren't so ugly or weren't so beautiful, and were really ugly and traumatic for a lot of people, and not just Blacks, like Willie said. There's so many things that I don't even know because I didn't learn it in our education system. So I think that definitely is important, and it shapes those conversations for sure.
I think that as you talk about like the way we view ourselves in America and like as a country really depends too on like how we view the rest of the world. And I think not only does our country do a terrible job teaching like kids about like our own history, but we do a pretty terrible job teaching kids about like the rest of the world's history as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember I went to like a small Catholic school for like K-8, and then I transferred to like a K-12 school for high school. And I remember getting to high school and being shocked that like none of the kids in my class could even like name the 7 continents. And like, how do you expect someone to like understand like the intricacies of like other cultures or, foreign like policy or history or anything like that when like they can't even tell you like where any countries are on the map or like whether Africa is a country or a continent. And I think that just like speaks to America's like individualism and like how we view ourselves. And I think that feeds into like the nationalism and like xenophobia that you see here on top of just all the other just craziness of the way we teach our own history.
If anyone else wants to say something, I just want to say like that I think so much great things were said, like really beautiful points. Because this is I think just a great discussion in itself. And I think it's super important that people do hear this to kind of face the brunt of the things that they don't necessarily know about. But I believe every single marginalized group or disenfranchised group in America has dealt with their education not be brought to the light. And that's something I'm still constantly learning. The fact that Clemson was actually Cherokee land at first, and learning more about indigenous people, the fact that the Stonewall riots that was not taught in my education system. So many things I think we're having to try to relearn is definitely going to be a constant thing, because if you're a part of a marginalized group and it does not fit the majority, your education will not always be pushed to the front. And so now it is taking time to learn a lot of things, because there's so much stuff I'm just constantly learning as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely is one of those things where you're just constantly having to learn and check what we are learning, and making sure, like, questioning, like, did we get the full story? We need the full story. We have less than a minute, so this looks like it concludes our part of our book club. Any last comments, concerns? Okay, well, in that case, we'll end here.